Hello and welcome. I'm Misuma Katauka and you are watching NewsX World. Let's take a look at some of the top stories. Australia, Britain, Canada and Portugal have all formally recognized a Palestinian state, with French President Emmanuel Macron hosting today's two-state solution summit. Macron has announced France's intention to recognize Palestine in July, confirming to Palestinian President Mahmoud Abbas, sparking anger in Israel and the United States. Several world leaders are expected to formally recognize a Palestinian state at a summit in New York, including Denmark being among the countries taking this step, while Israel warns and considers possible West Bank annexation and it moves on with its barrage into Gaza. Iran's atomic energy chief and Vice President Mohammad Eslami have arrived in Moscow for talks, according to the Iranian embassy in Russia. This visit comes after the UN Security Council refused to permanently lift sanctions, with 3 European countries seeking to reimpose them over alleged violations of the 2015 nuclear deal. Russia has asked the UN Civil Aviation Agency to ease sanctions on aircraft spare parts and overflights, calling Western restrictions unlawful coercive measures. The sanctions have cut off Russian airlines from direct access to parts for more than 700 Airbus and Boeing jets, forcing them to rely on complex indirect import routes. U.S. lawmakers held their first House of Representatives visit to Beijing in 6 years, meeting Chinese Defense Minister Dong Jun to discuss strengthening military-to-military communications. The bipartisan delegation led by Democratic Representative Adam Smith comes after Presidents Donald Trump and Xi Jinping agreed to further talks. Google seeks to avoid forced sale of online ad business as antitrust trial begins in Virginia, U.S., with the DOJ and coalition of states pushing to make Google sell its ad exchange ADX. Where publishers pay a 20% fee, Google proposes policy changes to support competition instead. T-Mobile names Srini Gopalan as the next CEO, effective from November 1st, succeeding Mike Sievert, who will become vice chairman. Gopalan, former CEO of Deutsche Telekom Germany and executive at Bharti Airtel, Capital One and Vodafone, had served as T-Mobile COO. Super Typhoon Ragasa has hit northern Philippines with winds of 215 km per hour and gusts up to 295 km per hour, prompting President to order full alert across government agencies. The storm has triggered suspension of classes and work, cancelled 24 domestic flights, halted ferry services, and raised risks of floods, landslides, and storm surges over 3 meters. Speaking at Russia's Security Council meeting, the Russian President Vladimir Putin has said that he's ready to extend the last remaining arms control treaty with the US, but only if Washington agrees. The New START treaty, which limits the number of strategic nuclear weapons each side can deploy, is set to expire on February 5, 2026. With just over 4 months to go, talks on a renewal have not started yet. The war in Ukraine has strained ties between Moscow and Washington, while President Trump has spoken of a new deal, one that could include China. President Putin has also said that he's willing to extend the current treaty by 1 year and stick to its limits, but only if the US does the same. He added that Russia would reassess its position after that based on how the situation develops. This comes after the Trump-Putin Alaska summit, where both leaders discussed arms control and Ukraine, but failed to reach a breakthrough. Now, for this discussion, we're joined by Andrew Latham. He's a professor of international relations, joins us live from Minneapolis, and Professor Georgi Toleraya. He's an international affairs expert joining us from Moscow. First, Professor Andrew, I would like to come to you for my first question. What are the potential global security implications if the New START treaty expires without renewal?
If it expires without renewal, then the caps are off in terms of the number of warheads and the number of launchers, etc. The deal was done initially back in 2010 in order to put caps on that would mitigate or dampen the escalatory tendency when it comes to nuclear weapons and nuclear arms races. It bears highlighting as well that President Putin has not offered to extend the treaty. He's made a political pledge to honor the treaty for an additional year, aspects of the treaty, not, by the way, the verification aspects of the treaty, which have been in abeyance, have been suspended since 2020 or 2023, depending on how you count it. And so that's a real concern for the United States. And another concern for the U.S. is getting China to the table. China wasn't a big nuclear player back in 2010. It is increasingly now, and ideally, from a Washington perspective, Beijing, Moscow, and Washington would be doing this deal.
And now I would like to come to Professor Georgi for my follow-up question. Professor Georgi, why do you think President Putin decided to say this now, that if U.S. agrees to do that, then we will also do it? What do you think the timing suggests?
Hello?
Yes, Professor, we can hear you. Professor Georgi, should I repeat my question?
No, it's okay. Well, I think it's a very wise and timely statement, because otherwise we will be left without any limitations to the arms race, to the strategic arms race. And this is also important for other aspiring nuclear powers to limit their aspirations, because if the two major powers do participate in some kind of control, then it puts a natural brake to others. However, it's difficult now to go on with the full-scale prolongation of the treaty, because the US wants China to be involved, China doesn't want to be involved. So the time which is left is so short that it's impossible to discuss all the very complicated technical and specialized issues which are involved. So this one-sided concession, I would say, by Putin is a way to get out of the impasse. Of course, there's an element of pressure on the US as well, because Putin said that this cannot happen on condition that the US won't pursue this so-called Golden Dome, the anti-missile shield system, which could undermine the strategic potential of Russia as well as other countries. But this is, I think, a welcome juncture, a welcome development for the time being, to let the countries sort out their differences in the months and maybe years to come.
And Professor Georgi Toleraya, why do you think now that they are thinking of joining or inviting China to, or including China to this proposal or new arms control deal? Will it complicate things further or reshape future negotiations?
Well, of course, Russia is not responsible for what Chinese want to do or what their plans are. So involving China, meaning put additional pressure on China and on Russia as well. Russia is not interested in this, and China maintains the position that they are limited, that their nuclear potential, missile and nuclear warheads potential is limited. Although some experts expressed doubt in that, and that they shouldn't be a part of any bilateral negotiation between Russia and US.
And Professor Andrew, I would like to come and to you now. What do you think, why they're thinking of including China in this new arms control deal?
Well, if you go back to 2010 and the long history of US-Soviet pre-Russian times, arms control negotiations, they were bilateral. They were between two countries, the two superpowers that had the majority of nuclear weapons. China had what was called a minimal nuclear deterrent, sometimes numbered in the tens and twenties of nuclear warheads, and that's not the case anymore. China now has, depending on who's counting, some 2,000 nuclear warheads. So it is a player. It has to be at the table. It is one of the three nuclear superpowers. If the US and Russia agree to limits and China doesn't, that gives China the upper hand in some respects. So getting all three at the table to negotiate a mutually limiting or capping agreement would be stabilizing. The fly in the ointment here is not Russia. The fly in the ointment is very much China. China does not have a history or a tradition in the Cold War or post-Cold War era of participating in these kinds of negotiations and in limiting its nuclear options. And as my colleague in Moscow pointed out, one of the real complicating factors is the American anti-ballistic missile system. If you can destroy the other side with 100 nuclear weapons, and then that side develops the ability to shoot down 100 nuclear weapons, you don't have any deterrent capacity. Mutually assured destruction, both sides can obliterate each other, therefore neither side should start a war, goes out the window. So the Golden Dome is really a complicating factor here as well. China's reticence, the Golden Dome, and I wonder a little bit about the timing. I think this in some ways has to do with President Putin looking to position Russia on the global stage as a responsible nuclear power, a responsible great power against the backdrop of the war in Ukraine, etc. So I'm not discounting that diplomatic dimension either.
Right. Thank you to both our professors for joining us. Please stay with us as we stay on this region now. Polish Prime Minister Donald Tusk has warned that Poland will not hesitate to shoot down any objects that violate its airspace and pose a direct threat. However, he has said that the country will adopt a more cautious approach in situations that are less clear-cut, emphasizing the need to avoid actions that could escalate this conflict. Tusk's statement comes amid heightened tensions in the Baltic region, following Estonia's report that 3 Russian fighter jets violated its airspace last Friday. Poland has previously reported that more than 20 Russian drones entered its airspace on the night of September 9 to 10th. The Kremlin has responded to the Estonian allegations, describing them as baseless and intended to stir tensions, adding that Russian military pilots operate strictly in accordance with international law. Let's listen in to what the Polish Prime Minister has said.
Każdej decyzji, która ma na celu unicestwienie obiektów, które mogą zagrażać nam, na przykład rosyjskich myśliwców, jeśli będą naruszały nasze na przykład będą latały nad naszymi wodami terytorialnymi, ale ja muszę mieć też 100% pewność. I Państwo dobrze rozumiecie, nie będę rozwijał tego wątku, że wszyscy sojusznicy będą traktowali to dokładnie w taki sam sposób jak my.
Now we go back to our guest discussion with Professor Andrew Latham and Professor Georgie Toloraya. Now first I would like to go to Professor Andrew. Professor Andrew, so how might this readiness to shoot down any airspace violations in Poland's airspace affect its relationship with, particularly with Russia?
Well, the upside is that it's clarifying. The policy is clarifying, and that's important in terms of the logic of deterrence. So if you knowingly and willfully violate Polish airspace, NATO airspace, we will respond as we are entitled to under international law, and we will shoot you down. That's the clarifying piece. The murkier piece is that President Tusk has said that if there's any ambiguity, then caution kicks in. If it's not clear that this is a deliberate attempt to cross the border in one way, shape, or form, to enter Polish airspace, that he will approach this with caution, which is a good thing. Deterrence requires clarity, but nobody wants unintended escalation that can result ultimately in a nuclear exchange. Nobody's interested. So I think he has struck the right note, even if that note is not well received in all quarters.
And Professor Georgie, now I would like to come to you. Do you think that although in other media, it's said that Russia has violated and Russia has denied these allegations. How is this news reflected in Russia, if you can tell us from where you are?
Well, I don't think that anybody here believes that Russia would willfully violate the NATO airspace with the risk of escalation. And the Polish incident is still murky. And I've seen no evidence that it was really a Russian drones, that they were intentionally sent to Poland. Same with the Romanian case, and now with the Estonian case, there's sort of a campaign. We have to be very cautious at this point, because if, for example, a Russian jet is shot over the Baltic neutral airspace, that could be a really casus belli. I don't think anybody wants it, and nobody intends to do this. So we should be very cautious, and the rules of engagement and the rules of behavior are quite clear, and nobody's going, I think, to violate them willfully.
And Professor Andrew, I would like to come to you for a follow-up question based on both your answers. Do you think that this diplomatic or military measures is enough to prevent any accidental escalation?
Accidental, perhaps. And look, neither side, I think, wants an all-out shooting war that might terminate in a nuclear exchange. Neither side wants that. The problem, as Clausewitz and Thucydides and others have been warning us for millennia now, is we can't always control the dynamics. We get unintended consequences. And the way to minimize that is to be clear but cautious. And I think Tusk has made the appropriate signals. Do not willfully transgress our border and enter our airspace. The consequences will be clear. However, if a pilot makes an error or a drone goes off course and it's accidental, then of course we can deal with that short of the use of force. I think this is perfectly predictable given what's happening or the way it's reported on both sides of the divide. There's confusion about who's doing and so on. And this is an attempt at clarification. It's signaling clearly what is already obvious to everybody. If anybody violates anybody else's airspace, especially a quote unquote adversary, they're inviting that platform to be shot down. So there's nothing surprising about it. It's simply the clarity with which it's being transmitted to various audiences.
Right. With that, I would like to thank both our guests, Professor Andrew Latham and Professor Georgi Toleraya, for joining us and sharing that insight. Now we move on to our next news. A UN-established commission on Ukraine has said that an investigation into drone attacks and deportations of adults from Russian-held Zaporizhia province has revealed coordinated and organized steps by Moscow to capture greater territory while pressuring locals to leave. The chair of the Independent International Commission of Inquiry on Ukraine, Eric Moss, has revealed his probe's findings in Geneva today. Let's listen in.
In May 2025, our conference room paper, the Commission documented widespread and systematic attacks with short-range drones by Russian armed forces targeted civilians in Kherson province. We concluded that these acts have been committed pursuant to a coordinated state policy and amount to crimes against humanity of murder, as well as war crimes of attacking civilians.
Now, footage published by Yanina Pavlenko, the mayor of Yalta, shows that she claims is the aftermath of a drone attack on school in the Foros suburb of the Crimean city. 13 people have been injured, according to officials in Yalta. Today, the head of the Kremlin-backed government in annexed Crimea, Sergei Aksyonov, has claimed that the Ukrainian military had targeted the Crimean resort town of Foros, damaging the grounds of a sanatorium and a school. Russia annexed Crimea in 2014 and wants Kyiv and Western countries to recognize the peninsula as part of its territory. Now we move on. A delegation of U.S. lawmakers met with Chinese Defense Minister Dong Jun today in the first House of Representatives visit to Beijing in 6 years. These talks are aimed at bolstering exchanges, including military-to-military communication. The bipartisan delegation was led by Democratic U.S. Representative Adam Smith, the current top Democrat on the House Armed Services Committee that oversees the U.S. Defense Department and armed forces. According to China's state-run news agency, Dong has urged the lawmakers to eliminate interfering and restrictive factors and adopt constructive and pragmatic measures to help improve military-to-military relations and bilateral ties. Let's listen in.
Better lines of communication between our two countries, in general, in particular, between our two defense committees. We are the first delegation from the United States House of Representatives since 2019, and we feel strongly that there should be more frequent visits in this robust conversation. We want to open up the lines of communication.
在当前中美关系整个大的背景下，你们的来访体现了主张中美之间的交流，应该说这是有识之士的正确决定。
Now for this discussion, we are joined by Andrew K.P. Long. He's a China strategist, joins us live from Hong Kong. Thank you very much, Andrew, for joining us again. Good to see you. Now, what role could renewed military-to-military communication between the U.S. and China play in reducing the risk of conflict in sensitive regions like South China Sea or Taiwan Strait?
Well, of course, the Trump administration is unlikely to let up on its countermeasures to contain and confront China militarily, ideologically, technologically, and on trade, and on all fronts, in fact. Because China has been perceived as an existential threat to American dominance or influence in the world, particularly in the Asia-Pacific. The recent display of China's advanced armament, including intercontinental hypersonic missiles, which are capable of multi-warhead, separately navigable re-entry vehicles that can circumnavigate the group, and also hypersonic mid-range missiles that can threaten aircraft carriers, as well as advanced drones and sixth-generation fighter jets. And all these are ringing alarm bells in the Pentagon. In case that any kind of wrongly calculated move could push the two countries into unwinnable wars on both sides. So I think that this is the reason why the military has starting to reopen a much closer dialogue to reach at least understanding on the modus operandi, particularly, as you mentioned, in the South China Sea, because in the South China Sea, lots of American assets in the first island chain center in Okinawa, the second island chain center in Guam, and then you have the Quad with Australia and Japan, with the nuclear submarine deals with the United Kingdom, as well, and of course you have the closer military alliance between Japan and South Korea, not to mention the Philippines. So and then of course the Taiwan Strait. So there are lots of fresh points, potential fresh points, which would China's latest display of its military capabilities makes these fresh points much more risky and dangerous. Hence, the need to reach some sort of an understanding on both sides.
Right. With that, I would like to thank Andrew K.P. Long for joining us and sharing that insight. Now we move on to Middle East. Palestinian presidential spokesman Nabil Abu Rudaini has welcomed the United Kingdom's decision to recognize the state of Palestine. He spoke from Ramallah, where President Mahmoud Abbas is expected to address the United Nations General Assembly by video link after the U.S. denied him a visa to travel to New York. Let's listen into what the Palestinian spokesperson has said.
Recognition of the UK is very important because this proves that the two-state solution is still living, and Britain is an old ally of the United States and Israel. Now it's taking the right direction, the right policy, and this is very important, and we encourage all countries to recognize the state of Palestine, because this is the only way for peace and security in the area. Without a Palestinian state, without the two-state solution, there won't be security or peace in the region as well.
The UK joined Australia, Canada and Portugal in extending recognition, aligning with more than 140 countries that support Palestinian aspirations for statehood. Now for this discussion, we are joined by Mark Sutherland. He's a geopolitical commentator, joins us live from London. Thank you very much, Mark, for joining us again. Now today we have already talked about this, but can you give us again, why do you think that UK has recognized, given its stakes on its history on helping the born or helping the birth of Israel? Sorry.
Asuma, good to be with you again. Well, under the Balfour Agreement, the British were given the mandate. Once the Ottoman Empire had been defeated, then nation states were created in the Middle East. The Jewish nation Israel, initially leading up to all the negotiations, the land that they were promised is actually where we would look at what was called Transjordan, if not Jordan now, under a mandate of in 1947. But by the time that decision was made, where Churchill gives away 78% of the land that was promised, and has a little hiccup in regard to asking Sykes-Picot to draw borders as well, then what happened is that Israel ends up with 22% of the land that was promised to them. Let's just, without reiterating this, but it's really important, a two-state solution was offered in 1947. The Arab states turned it down. The Arabs turned it down. They then decided to invade. They have been offered a two-state solution 4 times. The important thing for me on a personal level, when you look back to look at this, and I highly recommend the work of Yigal Korman, who runs Memory, is to look at all of the history in regard to the PLO, Fatah, where they have come from. And I'll just give you another little bit of history. That after the first Kuwait War, the Arab countries then decided that they would stop to fund the PLO. Then after that, because the Oslo Accords, the funding came back via the United States. One of the comments that would be made by people on the ground is that suddenly the leaders of the PLO were then just self-aggrandizing themselves, buying them some very expensive cars and building mansions in Ramallah and Gaza at that time. The reason why I say all this is because, like very often, when people move from assuming to move from a jihadist terrorist mandate into putting a suit on and thinking that their behavior is now going to be different, we have to remember that that Abbas was elected. He's in the 20th year of his 4-year term. And the other thing as well is when they have things in place which is pay for slay, which is encouraging people to kill Jews. If they are then imprisoned, then their family is supported by the PLO. With all of that background, the UK and other countries that have decided to then at a UN meeting to then recognize the two-state solution, as they call it, to recognize a Palestinian state. It's rather interesting that they're then using Rosh Hashanah to do that. So religious Jews will not be at the table to push back immediately, and they of course are not delaying that. There are a lot of underhand tactics within this theater, and has been explained by Netanyahu, Israel is not going anywhere. And the Judea and Samaria, which is what is the right name for the West Bank, of course the Palestinians would call that the West Bank, but Judea and Samaria, and that is now up for to make that part of Israel as out of the Oslo agreements. That was all going to be leading to that discussion, in my opinion. Asuma, sorry.
Right. Thank you very much, Mark, for joining us again and sharing your insight. Now we move on to our next news. The head of the Palestinian mission in London, Hussam Zomlot, has raised the Palestinian flag today after Britain formally recognized Palestine as a state. He called it a long overdue step, describing the move as a refusal to accept erasure. Let's listen into what the ambassador has said.
In the same capital of the Balfour Declaration, after more than a century of ongoing denial, dispossession and erasure, the UK government has finally taken the long overdue step of recognizing the state of Palestine. The state of Palestine, It is about ending the denial of the Palestinian people's inalienable right to freedom and self-determination. And it is an acknowledgement of a historic injustice. Ladies and gentlemen, Palestine exists. It has always existed, and it always will.
Now we move on to our next news. Egyptian President Abdel Fattah al-Sisi has pardoned Egyptian-British activist Alaa Abdel Fattah, ending years of imprisonment marked by hunger strikes and international pressure. Abdel Fattah, who is 43 years of age, became Egypt's most prominent political prisoner and a symbol of resistance to Sisi's crackdown on dissent. His case drew global attention during the 2022 COP27 climate summit when campaigns for his freedom intensified. A former blogger and developer, he had been jailed multiple times before and after the 2011 Arab Spring. His mother, Laila Suif, met British Prime Minister Keir Starmer earlier this year to press for his release. The pardon comes after authorities reviewed his case last month